Hello, and welcome back to the Secular Homeschool Revolution podcast. This is episode 11. My name is Ashley. I am your host, and today we are going to discuss the harmful effects of book banning and how you, as a homeschool family, can empower your kids through the bans. And I do have a special guest. But before I introduce him, you guys know I like to do life updates, podcast updates. So let's get into it. As far as my life update goes, life has been a roller coaster. I've been all gas, no brakes. We just wrapped up our 2023-2024 co op year, and we ended it with a bang. And not to brag, or maybe I'm being biased, but we had an incredible last couple of weeks with co op. Um, Again, follow our social media for the culture homeschool. The kids, our youngest group, we named all of our kids' groups after fruit. So we have the lemons. They worked an entrepreneurship class, and it was about building a taco truck business. So at the end, they got to serve tacos to co op and work out inventory, profit loss. It was the cutest thing ever. Then we had the kids who did a fashion design class strut their stuff in a fashion show. We set up the chairs in our main banquet hall where we host our co-op, and like they were actually walking down the runway. My co-founder had like her flash on. It was pretty incredible. The kids all looked super proud of themselves. My kid created a bluey circle skirt, and she paired it with purple rhinestone fishnets, gold shoes, black and white suspenders, a bluey like crop top, and fancy blue eyeliner with some rhinestone sunglasses. It was incredible to see how confident every single kid was. We had a kid do a cartwheel down the runway. We had some do like or who created pieces that shifted and changed into things. It was amazing. Then what else did we have? Oh, then our oldest kids, our grapes, they did a mock trial, and they were very serious. It was very order in the court, and the prosecutor was drilling the witness, and she's like, answer the question. No, answer the question. So it was overall an amazing thing. Oh, and we also hosted the most inclusive potluck I had ever been to. We do have several families who were vegan in our community. So we had lots and lots of vegan options, gluten-free options, dairy-free options. I mean, my husband has a lot of food allergies, so he just expects when he goes into spaces like that to never have any options, and he was able to indulge. So I'm really thankful for our community to be able to have spaces like that that are aware of everyone's needs. It's very thoughtful. Also, a huge shout out to my daughter Carson, also known as Kari. She snagged the Young Pegasus Poetry Award for 2024 for her age group. And it's funny because their dad usually does some work with them in regards to like writing, and especially as it gets closer to April for Poetry Month. And he had told them about this contest that's local to San Antonio, and that he would, help them if they were interested in submitting something. And we, of course, expected them to say yes, they were interested. And our oldest, she was all in. Kari, absolutely not. But we were like, oh, sorry, it really wasn't a choice. We really want you to work on this. So she moaned and groaned and complained every time they had a writing session. And even like created a song about how boring writing poetry was. And this was all because we were not letting her binge watch TV, which was her preference. And it was only like 30-minute writing sessions, but for her they were like the most excruciating thing ever. So when we got the email, I just assumed it was going to be my oldest because she was just way more engaged. And I really didn't want to turn in Kari's poem because it was, it's one of those things as a parent, you want your kid to do their best, but then I know I have to stop myself. I want to edit my kids' stuff, but I don't because I don't want it to mess with their self esteem, XYZ. But I really didn't, I wasn't feeling her poem. But my husband was like, "Dup, that's what she wrote. Let's see what happens." So my oldest didn't end up winning anything, but I do think it was because her poem was too niche. At that time, she was really into reading the book series Wings of Fire. So her poems were about the different characters, the different dragons in Rings of Fire, and I don't think it was fully understood or it met the writing assignment, but she was committed to writing about dragons. And so Kari ended up winning for her age group, and she comes with a smile on her face. "Well, I sure know how to make lemonade out of lemons." Yeah, girl, that's exactly what you did. So I'm glad I didn't edit her poem or discourage her. I'm glad my husband encouraged to just submit it as is. And I think other people may have found it funny, but it was basically about her not wanting to do the assignment and now is willing to do any future writing assignments because she feels so confident. Also, on the podcast front, I did hit a high of 60 listeners, but then I took a huge nosedive to 53. But you know what? I'll own it. I do definitely think that was on me because I have been MIA for several weeks. And so I'm going to take responsibility with it. And so my apologies. But I will tell you that I genuinely love having this podcast. And I want to get on track, and I keep saying that, but I don't see it happening consistently. But I do appreciate the community, and I am going to make a bigger effort. So thank you guys for sticking with me through my ups and downs. And I'm assuming that you guys who are still here enjoy the content. So we are here to discuss, the impacts of banning books. So let's get into the discussion. So we are here to discuss banned books and their impact. I do want to take you on a journey of discovery that was sparked by a banned book that ignited my oldest daughter's love for reading. So, for the past 2 years, I have been on a mission to spark some interest in my daughter to love reading. Initially, we would read 30 minutes a day. And for me, I was like, ooh, we get to read for 30 minutes a day. And she didn't feel that way. She felt like it was more of a chore, something for her to check off. And it was missing joy. And I wasn't satisfied with that. So I truly believe that if a kid doesn't love reading, they just haven't found their story or their genre. So I switched gears and I swapped out us listening to music like K-pop, Olivia Rodrigo, Taylor Swift for audiobooks. And initially, they weren't super thrilled. There was a lot of moaning and groaning and negative ad libs through the stories. But I stuck with it because I felt like this was the quickest way to help them, help her explore different stories and find out like what would truly resonate with her to just be in love with reading. And enters Zoe Washington by Janae Marks. This story was so good. It's about this girl who loves baking, and baking actually helped put her on a journey to help her father, who was incarcerated. This story just does such a great job at discussing themes like social justice, equity, systemic racism. And Parker, my oldest, was hooked. I mean, she listened to the book during breakfast and lunch. So this was the first book that she was really pushing to listen to outside of just car rides. She even went the extra mile to join the author's email list so that she could be notified about the sequel. And that was the moment that I pretty much geeked out. So what she liked about the story was, Zoe finding self acceptance, making a change. She liked the social justice components because I think that's aligns a lot with our family and the things that we talk about. So I found Amari and the Night Brothers, and that one was about a girl accepting who she was. She came from different circumstances. There was like magic and sci fi wrapped in. And that like fueled it. That just like hit it. And she has been a reader ever since. But I truly believe that it was taking the time to be intentional to find her just right story. But going back to my initial point, so Zoe Washington is a book that is banned in many school districts. So if she was in a traditional educational setting, she wouldn't have access through the school system to be introduced to that story. And so I think that's going to start our conversation on the impact of banned books, especially with kids. So today we do have a special guest joining us on the Secular Homeschool Revolution podcast. Let me introduce you to Anthony Gordon. He is a career educator with a passion for English who specialized in promoting academic equity in marginalized communities. He's not only a writer and community organizer, he is also a dedicated anti racist, diversity, equity, and inclusion specialist. And most importantly, he's my husband. I'm excited to have this conversation with him and with you all today and to get his professional expertise and personal insight. So please welcome Anthony.
Thank you for having me. I'm, really excited to see how well your podcast has been going. I'm excited to be a part of it. So let's get into it.
Anthony, as someone with a background in education and a passion for promoting inclusivity, what are your thoughts on the banning of books in homeschooling communities?
I think banning books in any context is wrong. I think especially for parents who are homeschooling, you have an opportunity to really create a diverse and inclusive environment for your students. And especially for homeschoolers of color, you may be unintentionally upholding some of the systems that you're attempting to avoid by homeschooling your kids. Books are a great way to bring the world closer to your home, and especially in a society we live in that has so much control over the information we intake. Books are one of the last resources where we could truly get authentic perspectives, voices from different people. And I think art in general as well. I think music, documentaries, we have to really be able to open our students up to explore the diverse worlds around them.
Thank you. Can you share some specific examples on how book banning has affected these communities, both historically and in present day?
Well, I think in a lot of cases, we always go back to slavery, right? A lot of these things are a product of slavery.
Mm-hmm.
Texts have always been used to manipulate people of color. If you go back and look at some of the older texts pre and post slavery, it almost reads like propaganda, right? Like text about blacks while slavery was going on portrayed happy, passive, workers who were dedicated to their masters. As soon as slavery was over, it quickly flipped to stereotypes about the lazy porch monkey or the over sexualized beast, right? And this became a norm and still exists today in a lot of the media that we see. So this control of the narrative, both inside and outside of the community, is really harmful. We know knowledge is power, and if you have the ability to edit the knowledge in your favor, then that power increases exponentially, right? So, it's really has a huge impact on kids mostly though. They can see it, they can hear it, they can feel it in the text, and if it doesn't relate to them or make that connection, then how can they truly ever understand or connect with what they're reading?
I agree with all of that and the control of the text. It does feel very eerie to the book banning, especially here in Texas. So thank you for sharing your thoughts on that.
Hmm.
Can you elaborate on how book banning perpetuates systemic inequalities and contributes to the erasure of marginalized voices?
Yeah, I want to touch on just the concept of dominant culture and the idea of who's defining what is acceptable.
Okay.
All right. A lot of the times it's not us. It's not BIPOC people. We don't get to create those definitions. And that's even when the stories are about us. All
Hmm.
right, especially if they're able to make it to the mainstream. A lot of times they either aren't written by BIPOC authors, or they're edited or made appropriate for consumption by people at higher levels in organizations who have the ultimate control. So, when you think about that, if you're in that space where your voice isn't authentically being represented, then you have to accept this palatable version of yourself.
Hmm.
Then it's naturally alienating, right? Like, if you're a reader and you're reading about yourself and it doesn't match the image or view you may have of yourself, or it further pushes a narrative, a negative narrative, an image you have of yourself, then that creates a bigger problem overall. So it really it's a huge issue to wrestle with.
So, in your experience, how do marginalized students respond to seeing themselves represented in literature, and what impact does it have on their academic and emotional well being?
I mean, I think I would go back to my own personal experience.
Okay.
As a student who went to private school through 10th grade, and halfway through high school, and private school being the literal mecca of white dominant culture in many ways. I was always told I wasn't good at or not interested in reading, but I read comic books profusely. I memorized hip hop songs and poems and was able to recite and perform them. So the problem wasn't that I didn't enjoy reading. The problem was that most of the books that I was being offered at school were all white or had black characters who were ignorant, cowards, or criminals. And I was growing up in a house with a college graduate, so that that wasn't my image of what black people were. So, like I said earlier, it's alienating, right? It turned me off. And what was attracting me at the time though was hip hop, right? It's the golden era, right? Public Enemy, Ice Cube. So again, I'm seeing these positive images of my community. I'm hearing these positive images of my community, and hearing how dominant culture is actually impacting me negatively. But again, that wasn't acceptable at the time in my place of learning, right? It wasn't the time we live in now. There weren't any Fat Pat songs on Target commercials. You know what I mean? So it wasn't until I was in 10th grade and discovered the autobiography of Malcolm X on my own. This wasn't something that, I got at school. I actually got it from a friend, and read it, and it opened up my world, right? It was the first time I had seen stories that I could relate to. Malcolm X was from Michigan. I'm from Michigan, right? The mosque he first worked at was in a neighborhood that I eventually ended up living in, right? So it was close to home. It connected. The stories were familiar. It made me feel more confident. And I haven't been able to put books down since. It also made me more critical when I went back to read the dominant culture text, the white authors. And, much to the chagrin of my teachers, they didn't enjoy that, and it's probably the reason 10th grade was my last year in private school. But that's another story.
I agree. That's another story. Another question I do have for you is, as an educator, and you have a lot of experience with middle school,
Hmm.
and we worked together at the same school, and I understand you had a lot of conflict with the district
Oh yeah.
because of the books that didn't relate to the community where we were serving, and you went against the grain a lot of times.
Hmm.
What was that like?
It was hard. Like I stayed in trouble. I constantly had people in my classroom, but it was one of those things where I recognized very early on as a teacher a lot of the issues I had as a student, and I didn't want to expose my kids to that. And so I used my classroom as an opportunity for us all to grow. But I had plenty of arguments with supervisors. The famous story of when I had a supervisor come and observe me doing a poetry unit. And by the end of my class, she was ordering Langston Hughes books off of Amazon because she was so blown away. But, that was one lesson out of an entire year where a lot of times teachers are forced into these boxes that don't allow their students to grow. So I just never have been one to not do right by kids.
Well, and speaking on your experience with kids, I do want you to touch base on what your work in Dallas was,
Hmm.
because you did have students who came in who had never passed the state test before,
Hmm.
and by you going against the grain, you ended up having some of the highest scores ever, I think, until this day that the schools had. Could you share how you exposing those kids to literature really impacted their educational careers?
Um, well, I think especially in public education, there's always a focus on numbers,
Right.
and I think sometimes they forget that behind those numbers is actual people who need to one day be able to go out into the world and make decisions and interact with different people and have conversations and be informed. And so I think my classroom became a safe space for kids to do that, and we did it through literature. I can't say one thing about when I was in Dallas. I did have a lot more freedom over how I taught and was able to use text without some of the pushback. There's always going to be pushback, but I had a bit more freedom because of some of what you talked about and the success I had. But I think opening up that space for kids to explore music, poetry, write their own poetry, perform poetry, um, it allowed them to see literature in a different space, so that now when I had to go back to that prescribed curriculum and that very whitewashed text, because I built so much context with kids in literature that they understood in their language and their experience, like I said earlier with Malcolm X, it was a lot easier for them to have those conversations if you just throw the right question into the mix. And so I think we we try to control how kids learn when a lot of times we just need to give them open space and spark a thought, and they'll drive the learning. And so I think by allowing kids to have access to these diverse books and different stories, you really open them up to a different world.
Why is it important for homeschoolers, including white homeschoolers, to have access to banned books and diverse stories?
I think it boils down to perspectives, right? Like we are our stories, and it's very easy for me to say you are this, you are that, or have a belief about a people if I haven't had a conversation with you.
Mm-hmm.
Because once I've heard your story, some of those perspectives that have been created for me may be harder for me to hold on to because there's personal connection in stories. And so I think books are the gateway to like larger community building. I look at the example of like you doing the Tracy Chapman Fast Car song with the girls, right? As a poetry analysis, text analysis, right?
Yeah.
Um, it's a very powerful song. It's very deep. It has some pretty hard images and ideas in it, especially for young kids. But what better space to sit down and actually talk through that than with someone who cares about your actual well-being and can pull out those lessons that and those themes in the text that you need for down the road that you may not even understand yet as a young person, but they were able to navigate that and walk through it with their parents. The other flip side of that is the whole context, the history thing that we got to talk about how this black woman was making history for a second time and not necessarily getting the recognition that she should have. So it was almost a dual lesson of like history along with this deep text analysis that's going to stick with them more than me just randomly handing them a text that doesn't connect to them at all. All right. So I think it's really important to understand that how stories drive that. I also think, especially for like our white homeschoolers who are really trying to be a part of the community and be allies, I think it doesn't stop at the book. Like make efforts to be a part of community, right? Frequent black bookstores, go to black shows related to some of the texts that you're reading with your kids. Be immersed in the community because community can't be built in a silo. And so it's important to take the step of reading, but it's also important to engage with the community and extend those stories so that you really have a true understanding of who we are as a people and how we all fit into this puzzle.
Would you agree that when you're exposing to different storylines, it helps build empathy, critical thinking, and cultural awareness?
For sure. Yeah, I think it gives you different perspectives on themes that we all have, right? And I think it brings the world a bit closer together, right? We may not come from the same neighborhood, but our experiences, especially as it relates to like social, emotional, relationship type things, are actually a lot more common than you would know. So it definitely increases those ideas of empathy and understanding where we come from.
So, for our last question, how can we work collectively to challenge and dismantle systems that perpetuate book banning and censorship?
So I have this saying that has really been like my theme for 2024. One of those doom scrolls at the start of the year, I saw a meme and it said, "Until the lions start telling the stories, the hunters will always be the heroes."
Oh, wow.
And that's really been resonating with me because we have to take control of our narrative. And it's such an important time right now. You think about it, we're all news reporters, we're all bloggers, we're all podcasters. You have literally the tip of the world at your fingertip most most of the time in your day. Right? So share your story. Share a book that you read that changed your life from a banned author. Start a co-op, right? Write a book or write some curriculum yourself, right? We're battling systems that have been extremely effective for a real long time. So it's going to take a lot of consistency and some forward thinking moving forward. So I think it's just that like we have to really use the power of our voice right now.
Thank you for sharing, Anthony. Before we wrap up, do you have any advice for homeschooling parents who want to ensure that their children have access to diverse and inclusive literature?
Yeah, I want to kind of double back to what I just said and like really stamp it. Community cannot be built in silos. You have to engage in community because if you're not connected to the community, how do you know that the texts that you're using aren't just as harmful as what they would commonly get from the mainstream, right? So making sure you have that opportunity to authentically engage in community. And I want you to also think beyond books. It's not just about books. BIPOC voices have been silenced in all forms of media: music, TV, movies. So, what's the difference between saying, I can't read To Kill a Mockingbird and slapping a parental warning label on a hip hop album with no profanity in it?
Hmm.
It's all harmful and it keeps kids from connecting to art in ways that are joyful and enriching for them. So, we can't put our own comfort before our kids' opportunity to grow. And I think that that's an important piece to keep at the forefront.
I do think whenever you are discussing like banned books and what's going on in the current political landscape, which is greatly impacting general education. I think a lot of this is more about the adults being uncomfortable
Yep.
and not wanting to have those conversations. I think that's the big issue with like LGBTQIA plus stories being banned. I think these kids, it would be normalized in conversation and it wouldn't be such a shock and awe or disapproval if these kids, if these adults had access to these stories and were fully able to just listen, but they live in their discomfort. And so they're blocking the young people, the kids' opportunity to grow and build empathy and understanding and learn a different kid's perspective. So I thank you so much for your time and energy and sharing it with me and the community I'm building. And again, thank you for honing in on that community can't be built in silos. I know you've been on the journey with me as far as being a homeschooler and a secular homeschooler and a BIPOC secular homeschooler. And it is, we are building a community because there aren't very many spaces that we can flourish. And so, like you said, there's ways to do it in person, online, through different mediums. So, thank you guys for joining me on the secular homeschool revolution. And I look forward to seeing everyone being in the movement and being revolutionary with the literature they expose their kids to. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. And to all of our listeners out there, remember, let's celebrate the power of literature, embrace diversity, and foster a love of learning in our homeschool journeys. And remember to stay revolutionary. Until next time.